Let's make this simple, Linda said as she placed a stack of folded napkins beside the turkey. Tonight we're going to take a vote about Margaret. The words hung over the Thanksgiving table like a cold draft slipping through a closed window. No one laughed. No one even looked surprised. Margaret Collins sat at the end of the long oak table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the same way she had folded them during church services for most of her life. At 68, she had learned that silence could reveal far more about people than arguments ever could. Around her, the room looked exactly the way Thanksgiving dinners were supposed to look in America. The kitchen smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and sweet potatoes topped with toasted marshmallows. Outside the window, the late November sky was already darkening, and the first hints of winter wind rustled the bare branches in Daniel's backyard. It should have been a peaceful evening. Margaret had driven the 22 miles from her small ranch house just before sunset, bringing with her a homemade apple pie and the cranberry relish her late husband had loved every year. For 40 years, she had been the one hosting Thanksgiving. This was only the second year someone else had taken over. Linda moved confidently around the table, setting down plates as if she were hosting a formal meeting instead of a family holiday. Her smile looked bright, but something about it felt rehearsed. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulders slightly hunched, his attention fixed on the glass of iced tea in front of him as if the answer to some difficult question might be floating inside it. Across the table, Emily, Margaret's 19-year-old granddaughter, shifted uneasily in her chair. She glanced at her grandmother and then quickly looked away, as though she already knew the direction the evening was about to take. Margaret noticed every detail. The way Linda's voice carried just a little too much confidence. The way Daniel avoided meeting her eyes. The way the room had grown strangely quiet despite the cheerful decorations hanging from the cabinets. A paper pumpkin centerpiece sat in the middle of the table, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans. It looked almost festive enough to hide what was really happening. Linda cleared her throat and leaned lightly against the counter. "It's nothing personal," she continued smoothly. "We just thought it would be fair if the whole family had a say." Margaret tilted her head slightly. She didn't ask what the vote was about. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited. In her experience, people who believed they were being reasonable were always eager to explain themselves. Daniel shifted again in his chair, finally glancing toward his mother. For a moment it looked like he might speak, but then his eyes drifted back to the table. Margaret recognized that hesitation immediately. It was the same look he had worn as a boy when he knew something was wrong, but wasn't sure how to stop it. The difference now was that he was 43 years old, and the silence belonged to him. Linda pulled out a small stack of note cards and set them beside the gravy boat. "Everyone will just write yes or no," she said. "That way it's democratic." Emily frowned. "Vote about what?" Linda turned toward Margaret with the kind of polite smile people use when discussing someone who isn't really part of the conversation. About whether Margaret should move somewhere more suitable. Maybe a senior community. Somewhere with people her own age. The sentence landed gently, almost kindly, but Margaret could hear the calculation beneath it. She had heard that tone before, in real estate offices, in polite letters from insurance companies, in conversations where someone had already decided the outcome long before asking the question. Margaret slowly reached for her water glass and took a small sip. The ice clinked softly. "A vote," she repeated quietly. Linda nodded. "Just to help everyone feel comfortable about the decision." Margaret placed the glass back on the table. Around her, the family waited. The turkey was still steaming. The cranberry sauce glowed bright red under the kitchen light. And yet something about the room had shifted completely, as if Thanksgiving had quietly turned into something else. Margaret looked around the table one more time, meeting each pair of eyes for just a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough that no one could tell whether she was surprised at all. Margaret did not answer immediately. She simply looked down at the folded note cards sitting beside the gravy boat, as if they were just another part of the table setting. The quiet in the room stretched longer than anyone expected. Linda shifted her weight slightly, clearly, anticipating some kind of protest or emotional reaction. Instead, Margaret reached for the cloth napkin beside her plate and carefully smoothed it across her lap. The movement was slow and deliberate, the same way she had done it at hundreds of dinners over the decades. The normalcy of the gesture seemed to confuse everyone. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain. Linda just means we are trying to plan ahead. Margaret raised her eyes toward him. The kitchen lights reflected faintly in her glasses, but her expression remained calm. She studied her son for a moment the way a teacher might study a student who had forgotten an important lesson. Daniel had always been a gentle boy when he was young. Even now, there was something hesitant about the way he spoke, as though he had rehearsed the words but still was not entirely convinced by them. Linda stepped forward before the silence could grow uncomfortable again. "We just want what is best for you," she said brightly. "You live alone in that big house. It is 20 miles from town. What if something happens and no one is nearby?" Margaret folded her hands together again. "Nothing has happened in 30 years, she replied quietly. Linda gave a short laugh that sounded polite but slightly forced. "That is exactly the point. You are not getting any younger." Across the table, Emily looked down at her plate. She slowly traced the edge of her fork along the rim without making a sound. Margaret noticed that too. Emily had always been observant, the kind of young woman who noticed the things people tried to hide behind polite conversation. The turkey continued to steam in the center of the table, untouched. The scent of roasted herbs filled the room, but no one seemed interested in eating anymore. Daniel picked up one of the note cards and turned it between his fingers. "It is just a discussion," he said quietly. "We thought it would be easier if everyone felt included." Margaret nodded slowly, as if she were considering that explanation. In truth, she was remembering the last few months. She remembered the afternoon when Linda had casually asked how large the property taxes were on the old ranch house. She remembered the phone call 2 weeks earlier when Daniel had suggested that maybe she should look into simpler living arrangements. At the time, Margaret had smiled and changed the subject. But she had listened carefully. People often believe that older women stop noticing things. Margaret had discovered long ago that the opposite was true. When life slowed down, observation became sharper. Linda placed a pen beside each card. "All right," she said with cheerful efficiency. "Everyone just write yes if you think Margaret should move to a senior community, and no if you think she should stay in the house." The words were spoken as calmly as someone describing a recipe. Margaret noticed how easily Linda said them. Emily finally looked up. "This feels strange," she murmured. Linda waved a hand lightly. "It is only practical." Margaret looked around the table again. For chairs, for pens, for small cards waiting for answers. She let out a slow breath and rested her fingertips against the edge of the table. Then she spoke in the same steady tone she had used all evening. "Before anyone writes anything," she said gently, "there is something the family should understand." The room became completely still after Margaret spoke those words. Linda's hand paused in the middle of sliding a pen across the table, and Daniel slowly looked up from the note card he had been turning between his fingers. Emily leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing the discomfort on her face. Margaret did not rush. She gently adjusted the sleeve of her sweater and glanced around the table once more, making sure every person was listening. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall behind the refrigerator, each second stretching the silence a little longer. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the dry sound of leaves moving across the driveway. Finally, Margaret folded her hands together and continued speaking in the same calm voice. 2 weeks ago I met with someone in town," she said. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Someone?" Margaret nodded. "A lawyer." The word landed quietly, but its effect was immediate. Daniel straightened in his chair, and the note card in his hand stopped turning. Linda gave a small smile that looked more cautious than confident. "What kind of lawyer?" she asked. Margaret answered without hesitation. "The same one who helped your father and me 30 years ago when we first bought the ranch house." Daniel's expression shifted slightly at the mention of his father. The house Margaret referred to sat about 20 miles outside town, surrounded by open land and the small orchard her husband had planted long ago. It had never been a grand property, but it had always been theirs. Margaret continued as if she were describing something completely ordinary. "His name is Robert Hayes. He still has the same office on Maple Street. The building with the red brick and the old oak tree in front." Emily nodded quietly. She knew the place. Everyone in town did. Linda crossed her arms, her posture suddenly more guarded. "I am not sure what that has to do with tonight," she said. Margaret looked at her kindly, the same way someone might look at a neighbor asking a question that had an obvious answer. "It has quite a lot to do with tonight," she replied. Daniel spoke carefully. "Mom, are you saying you changed something legally?" Margaret smiled faintly. I reviewed some things. The words were simple, but Daniel's shoulders stiffened as if the meaning behind them was becoming clearer. Linda gave a quick laugh. Well, that is good planning, but we are talking about living arrangements, not paperwork. Margaret did not argue. She simply reached into her purse, which rested beside her chair, and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind often used for formal documents. She placed it gently on the table next to the bowl of cranberry sauce. No one moved. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Daniel stared at the envelope as though it might suddenly start explaining itself. Linda glanced at it, and then back at Margaret. What is that? She asked. Margaret rested her fingertips lightly on top of the envelope. Just something Robert prepared for me, she said calmly. The quiet confidence in her voice made the room feel different again. The vote cards still sat untouched beside the gravy boat, but suddenly they seemed much less important than they had only moments earlier. No one reached for the envelope. It sat quietly beside the cranberry sauce, its edges perfectly straight against the polished wood of the table. Margaret did not push it toward anyone. She simply left her hand resting beside it, as though it were nothing more than another Thanksgiving decoration. Daniel stared at it for several seconds before finally speaking. Mom, he said carefully, what exactly did the lawyer prepare? Margaret looked at him with the same patient expression she had used when he was a child struggling with homework at the kitchen table. Something responsible, she replied. Linda gave a small breath of laughter that did not quite sound natural. Well, I hope you are not worried about us taking advantage of you, she said quickly. This conversation tonight is only about what is safest for you. Margaret nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a point in a polite discussion. Safety is important, she said. That is why I decided to review everything. She gently slid the envelope forward a few inches. The movement was calm and unhurried. Daniel finally picked it up, turning it over to read the return address printed in the corner. The name Robert Hayes appeared in neat black letters above the address on Maple Street. Daniel recognized it immediately. He had passed that building hundreds of times growing up. Is this a will? He asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. Not exactly. Linda leaned forward slightly, watching Daniel's hands. Then what is it? Margaret folded her hands together again. It is a trust agreement, she said. The room grew noticeably quieter after those two words. Emily looked from her grandmother to her father, sensing that the conversation had shifted into something more serious than anyone expected. Daniel slowly opened the envelope and removed the document inside. Several pages were clipped together at the top. He scanned the first paragraph, his eyes moving carefully across the legal language. Linda crossed her arms again. I still do not understand why that matters tonight, she said. Margaret's voice remained gentle. Because it explains how the house and the land will be handled in the future. Daniel looked up from the page. Handled how? Margaret glanced toward the window for a moment before answering. Outside, the dark outline of bare branches moved against the evening sky. Robert suggested that it might be wise to place the property into a living trust, she said. That way everything is organized long before anyone has to make decisions for me. Linda tilted her head. You could have talked to us about that, she said. Margaret smiled politely. I am talking to you about it now. Daniel returned his attention to the document. As he read further, his expression slowly changed from curiosity to confusion. He turned another page, then another. Mom, he said after a moment, this says the trust has conditions. Margaret nodded once. Yes. Robert thought that was sensible. Emily leaned closer. What kind of conditions? Margaret answered calmly. Simple ones. The property stays exactly where it is unless I decide otherwise. Daniel continued reading, and his voice grew quieter. And after that, Margaret met his eyes steadily across the table. After that, she said, the trust transfers the house only to family members who demonstrate that they believe I belong there. Linda's smile faded slightly. The vote cards still sat untouched beside the gravy boat, but suddenly they seemed much less important than the document resting in Daniel's hands. Daniel lowered the pages slightly, but he did not set them down. His eyes moved back to the paragraph he had just read as if he wanted to be certain he had understood it correctly. The kitchen lights reflected softly across the printed lines while the rest of the table remained completely still. Linda leaned forward just enough to read his expression. What does it say? She asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. It says the property cannot be transferred or managed by any family member who attempts to relocate Mom without her consent. The words settled into the quiet room one by one. Emily slowly lifted her head, her eyes moving from the document to her grandmother. Margaret remained composed, her hands folded lightly in front of her plate, as though the entire conversation had been expected all along. Linda straightened her back. "That is a very unusual condition," she said carefully. Margaret nodded politely. Robert thought it was reasonable. Daniel turned another page and continued reading silently. His forehead tightened slightly as he followed the next section of the document. The turkey in the center of the table had begun to cool, the steam no longer rising from the golden skin. The smell of sage and roasted herbs still filled the kitchen, but no one seemed to notice anymore. "Mom," Daniel said after a moment, "this trust also says something else." Margaret waited. "It says that if any immediate family member attempts to pressure you into leaving the property, that person becomes permanently excluded from inheriting it." Linda blinked once, clearly not expecting that detail. "Excluded?" she repeated. Daniel looked back at the page and nodded slowly. "Completely." Emily quietly set her fork down. Margaret's voice remained calm and even. "Robert believes clarity prevents misunderstandings." Linda folded her arms again, her expression tightening in a way that made her earlier confidence disappear. "Are you suggesting that tonight is some kind of pressure?" she asked. Margaret met her eyes with a gentle, almost sympathetic look. "I am simply explaining the document." Daniel read the final paragraph on the page, and then carefully returned the paper to the envelope. He placed it back on the table, though his hand lingered on top of it for a moment, as if he were still processing the implications. The small stack of vote cards beside the gravy boat suddenly seemed out of place, like props left over from a plan that no longer made sense. Emily glanced toward the cards, and then back at Linda. "So if someone tried to vote on where Grandma lives," she said slowly, "that might count as pressure." Linda did not answer immediately. Margaret reached for her water glass and took another quiet sip before setting it down again. "Families should always speak honestly with one another," she said gently. Daniel looked at the envelope again and then at his mother. The tension that had filled the room earlier had shifted into something heavier, something more complicated. The decision that had seemed so simple only minutes before was now tangled inside a legal document resting quietly between the cranberry sauce and the untouched turkey. Daniel slowly pushed the envelope back toward the center of the table, as if it had suddenly become heavier than paper should be. For several seconds no one spoke. The quiet felt different now. Earlier it had been the silence of a family preparing to make a decision about someone else. Now it was the silence of people realizing that the situation had already changed long before they noticed. Linda finally broke the stillness. "I think this is being misunderstood," she said carefully. Her voice carried the polite tone she often used when explaining something she believed was obvious. "No one here is pressuring Margaret. We are simply discussing practical options." Margaret looked at her calmly. "Of course," she replied. Emily shifted slightly in her chair and glanced at the vote cards again. The small white square still rested beside the gravy boat exactly where Linda had placed them. The pens beside them suddenly looked unnecessary. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly with one hand, the way people sometimes do when they are trying to untangle a complicated thought. "Linda," he said quietly, "maybe this is not the best moment for a vote." Linda turned toward him immediately. "Why not?" she asked. "We were trying to help." Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because the document makes it clear that Mom has already made arrangements." Linda gave a tight smile. "Arrangements can always be adjusted." Margaret did not respond right away. She simply reached forward and straightened the edge of the tablecloth near her plate. The movement was small but deliberate. "Some arrangements are meant to prevent confusion," she said gently. Emily watched her grandmother with quiet interest. She had grown up hearing stories about the ranch house outside town. Margaret and her husband had built most of it themselves decades earlier. Every fence post and fruit tree carried a memory. Emily understood that the place was not simply property. It was the center of Margaret's entire life. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "Mom," he said, "when did you decide to do this?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "The day Linda asked how soon I might consider moving." Linda's expression tightened slightly. "I was asking out of concern," she said quickly. Margaret nodded politely. "Concern often reveals important information." The clock on the kitchen wall ticked forward another minute. Outside the window, a passing car briefly illuminated the driveway before disappearing into the darkness of the road. The moment felt strangely quiet for a holiday evening. Emily finally reached across the table and picked up one of the vote cards. She turned it over once, then placed it back down exactly where she found it. "I do not think we need these anymore," she said softly. Daniel looked at the stack of cards and then at his mother. The plan that had seemed straightforward earlier in the evening now looked different from every angle. The envelope remained on the table between the serving dishes, quiet and unremarkable, yet somehow more powerful than the entire discussion that had filled the room only minutes before. Emily's quiet remark lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Daniel glanced at the stack of cards again, then slowly reached forward and gathered them into a neat pile. The soft scrape of cardboard against the wooden table sounded louder than it should have in the still kitchen. He slid the cards away from the gravy boat and placed them beside the salt shaker, as if removing them from the center of the table might somehow reset the evening. Linda watched the movement with narrowed eyes. "That was not necessary," she said. Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked down at the table, studying the patterns in the wood grain the way someone studies a map when they are not sure which direction to take. Margaret remained quietly seated at the end of the table. The calm in her posture had not changed. Her apple pie still sat untouched near the edge of the counter, the golden crust catching the warm light from the kitchen lamp. For decades, she had served that same pie after Thanksgiving dinner, always waiting until everyone finished their meal before cutting the first slice. Tonight, no one had even started eating. Emily folded her hands together and looked toward her grandmother. "Grandma," she said softly, "did you really meet with the lawyer just because of that question about moving?" Margaret considered the question for a moment before answering. "Not only because of the question," she said, "because of the pattern behind it." Linda shifted in her chair. "Pattern?" Margaret nodded. "Conversations have a way of revealing intentions when they happen often enough." Daniel looked up again. "You mean the times we talked about safety and convenience?" Margaret's voice stayed gentle. "Yes, and the times those conversations always ended with the same suggestion." Linda leaned forward slightly, which was only meant to help. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "Help can take many forms." The wind outside brushed against the side of the house again, making a faint tapping sound near the kitchen window. Emily glanced toward the dark glass and then back at the table. "Grandma has lived in that house longer than anyone," she said quietly. "It feels strange to talk about it like it is temporary." Daniel sighed and rubbed his temple again. "No one said it was temporary," he muttered. Linda gave him a quick look before turning back to Margaret. "We were trying to plan responsibly," she said. Margaret did not challenge the statement. Instead, she reached forward and gently adjusted the position of the cranberry bowl that had been nudged earlier when the envelope was placed on the table. The movement was small, but it restored the table to its original balance. "Planning is wise," she said softly. "That is why Robert recommended putting everything in writing." Daniel's eyes drifted back toward the envelope again. The document inside had already shifted the entire evening in ways he had not expected. The simple plan for a vote had quietly disappeared without anyone formally canceling it. Emily noticed the same thing. She glanced around the table at the untouched plates, the cooling turkey, and the silent adults who suddenly seemed unsure what to say next. Finally, she spoke again, her voice careful but clear. "Maybe tonight was supposed to be about being together," she said. Margaret gave her granddaughter a warm look. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on her face. The tension in the room had not vanished, but something about Emily's words reminded everyone that the evening had begun as a holiday before it became a discussion about control. For a moment, no one moved. The faint smile on Margaret's face remained, quiet and steady, while the rest of the table seemed to hold its breath. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and looked around the room as if he were seeing the evening from a completely different angle. The plates, the decorations, the cooling turkey in the center of the table all suddenly looked less like the setting for a family celebration and more like a stage where something important had just been revealed. Linda was the first to shift again. She picked up her glass of water, took a small sip, and placed it back down with careful precision. "Well," she said after a moment, "perhaps this discussion simply happened at the wrong time." Her voice carried the controlled politeness she used when she was trying to recover her footing. Daniel looked at her, but did not immediately agree. Instead, his eyes moved toward Margaret again. "Mom," he said quietly, "were you worried we were going to push you out of your own house?" Margaret did not answer right away. She studied her son for a moment, the same thoughtful look she had worn earlier in the evening. "I was not worried," she said calmly. "I was paying attention." Emily glanced between them, sensing the shift in tone. For the first time since the conversation began, Daniel seemed less defensive and more reflective. He looked down at his plate, where the silverware still rested exactly the way it had been set before dinner. "I guess I did not think about how it sounded," he admitted. Linda opened her mouth slightly as if she wanted to respond, but Daniel raised his hand gently before she could speak. "Let me finish," he said. The room went quiet again. "Mom has lived on that land for more than 40 years, he continued slowly. "That house is not just a building. It is the place where Dad built the orchard, where we celebrated every holiday, where Emily learned how to ride her bicycle in the driveway." Emily smiled faintly at that memory. Linda remained still, watching Daniel carefully as he spoke. Margaret listened without interrupting. Daniel looked back toward the envelope resting near the cranberry sauce. "If the trust says that anyone who pressures you loses their inheritance," he said thoughtfully, "then maybe tonight already answered that question." Linda's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Margaret reached forward and gently turned the envelope so that the printed address faced the center of the table. "Robert told me something when we signed the papers," she said softly. Daniel looked up again. "What was that?" Margaret's voice remained steady and warm. "He said documents do not exist to punish families," she replied. "They exist to reveal them." The sentence settled over the table like the final piece of a puzzle falling quietly into place. Emily glanced once more at the stack of unused vote cards Daniel had moved aside earlier. They now looked almost forgotten, small pieces of paper from a plan that had quietly unraveled before it could begin. Daniel exhaled slowly and pushed his chair a few inches closer to the table. "Maybe we should stop talking about votes and start talking about dinner," he said. Margaret's faint smile returned. The tension had not disappeared completely, but something important had shifted. For the first time since the conversation began, the Thanksgiving table once again looked like a place where a family might actually sit down and share a meal. The suggestion lingered in the room for a moment before anyone moved. Daniel slowly reached toward the serving platter and picked up the carving knife, though his movements were far more careful than they had been earlier in the evening. The turkey had cooled slightly, but the familiar smell of roasted herbs still filled the kitchen, softening the tension that had hung over the table for the past hour. Margaret watched quietly from the end of the table, her hands resting comfortably near her plate. For the first time that evening, the moment felt closer to the kind of Thanksgiving dinner she had known for decades. Emily leaned forward and reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes, passing it toward her father without saying anything. The simple movement seemed to reset something unspoken between everyone at the table. Linda remained still for several seconds before finally adjusting her chair and reaching for the green beans. Her earlier confidence had faded into something quieter, something more careful. No one mentioned the vote again. The small stack of cards remained beside the salt shaker where Daniel had placed them, untouched and unnecessary. Daniel finished carving a few slices of turkey and placed them onto Margaret's plate first. The gesture was small, but it carried the quiet respect of an old habit he had not realized he missed. "Here you go, Mom," he said softly. Margaret thanked him with a gentle nod. Emily passed the cranberry sauce across the table and smiled faintly. "I think Grandma's pie should still be dessert," she said. Margaret chuckled quietly. That was always the tradition. The conversation slowly shifted into safer territory. Emily talked about her classes at college and a project she had been working on for the winter semester. Daniel asked a few questions, listening more carefully than he had earlier. The evening gradually found its balance again, though the earlier discussion still lingered beneath the surface like a memory that would not easily disappear. Linda spoke less than usual, focusing on arranging the dishes and occasionally offering short responses when someone addressed her. Margaret noticed this, but did not comment. She simply ate her meal and listened to the familiar rhythm of family voices returning to the room. Outside, the wind had settled, leaving the night quiet beyond the kitchen window. When the plates were finally cleared, Emily carried the apple pie to the center of the table. Margaret cut the first slice herself, the same way she had done every Thanksgiving for more than 40 years. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking again. "Mom," he said gently, "you belong in that house as long as you want to be there." Margaret looked at him with calm understanding. "I know," she replied. Across the table, Linda lowered her gaze to the plate in front of her. No one said anything about the envelope anymore. They did not need to. The document had already done its work long before dessert was served, quietly reminding everyone at the table that respect was not something decided by a vote.